were there any underage girls at that party that Trump attended with Jeffrey Epstein?
This is so ridiculous, and that they are trying to deflect from all the great things Donald Trump has done. There is no evidence that Donald Trump has committed a crime. Everyone knows that.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Behavioral Arts. My name is Spidey, and I use my degree in sociology and psychology, my certifications in criminal interrogation and body language analysis, and my experience as an award-winning mentalist to teach people behavioral analysis and practical psychology on stages and television shows all over the world. Just last week, U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi faced some intense questioning during a congressional hearing that focused a lot on the Epstein files, what has been released, what hasn't been released, and the mishandling of the entire case by the Department of Justice. It would be putting it lightly to say that things got really heated. But in the midst of her answers and non-answers, we saw some really interesting behaviors. What do her body language, facial expressions, and word choice actually reveal? And what do I think might be causing this chaotic behavior? Let's dive right in. Okay, so there was obviously a lot going on here. The hearing went on for more than 4 hours, and a lot of the questions were repetitive both in what was being asked and the way it was being answered. So I reduced it to a couple of clips that really give us the best moments to look at, and they're going to be a little longer than my usual because a lot of these questions took a long time to set up, but they're important for context. So let's dive right in, starting with one of the clips that has gone the most viral from the whole hearing.
I'm going to show you 2 photos of former Prince Andrew. Prince Andrew attended various parties with Jeffrey Epstein. Under the law Congress passed, you were allowed to redact photos to protect the victims of Epstein's trafficking operation. You redacted the photos of this victim's face because you were following the congressional law. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, that we redacted the victim's
Because you were following the congressional law, correct?
Yes.
Okay. You have now established that please put the photos back up, that we are looking at a trafficking victim. That's why I find it absolutely despicable that you sought to protect Epstein's clients, like former Prince Andrew. Last July, you closed the case on Epstein's abusers. So I ask you, Attorney General Pam Bondi, why did you shut down this investigation last July, and why have you not prosecuted former Prince Andrew?
I don't believe you asked Merrick Garland these questions when he was Attorney General and set before.
I agree with you.
You twice.
I'm reclaiming my time. I agree with you. I agree with you. During the Biden administration, I called for people looking at Epstein files. Merrick Garland dropped the ball, as did Attorney General Bill Barr, as did Alex Acosta, a whole string of failures, but you are in charge. You have the power to change things, to hold these men accountable, and you're doing the opposite. You're protecting them. So I want to move on to another man.
Can I answer
Donald
that,
Trump.
though?
I want to move on to another question.
Can I answer your question about protecting
You answered the question.
You're saying no. I love this.
I want to discuss another man, Donald Trump, who is all over the Epstein files. Like former Prince Andrew, Donald Trump attended various parties with Jeffrey Epstein. I want to know, were there any underage girls at that party or at any party that Trump attended with Jeffrey Epstein?
This is so ridiculous, and that they are trying to deflect from all the great things Donald Trump has done. There is no evidence that Donald Trump has committed a crime. Everyone knows that. This has been the most transparent presidency. He's the one that asked that those files
I'm reclaiming my time. I got your answer. You said there's no evidence.
Okay, so that's a really good example of how a lot of this hearing went and the way she answered a lot of the questions. And I want to start with that second answer that she gave about Donald Trump. So she's doing something here that she does a lot. And it's, instead of answering the question, she answers where she thinks the question is going. So in this case, he asked, were there underage girls at any of these parties? And instead of giving a yes or no or I don't know, she tries to get ahead of that and answer the question that's coming up after that, which would be, did Donald Trump participate in any illegal activities, to your knowledge? But in so doing, she tips her hand and reveals the topics that actually stress her out. Because she starts by mocking the line of questioning, which is something we very often do when we're stressed out by a topic. Maybe if I mock it enough, we'll move on to a different thing. So she does that, but behaviorally, we see such an incredible shift in confidence. If you'll notice right in the beginning, there's a hesitation. Usually when she's ready to jump in on something, we see her almost cut the person off with a lot of feistiness and turn her mic on and just jump in there. Here, she actually pauses. We see two separate eye blocks right in the beginning. This is whenever we blink for a little bit longer than a normal blink would be. And the research on eye blocking or slow blinking shows us that even children who are born blind do this. So it's a human reflex. It's not a learned behavior. And we do this when we're trying to focus on something or away from something. So think of the eyes like the garage door to your thoughts. So sometimes you'll notice something great happens and we close our eyes as we celebrate because we want to hold on to this moment. Or sometimes you get negative news and you block your eyes like this as you go, oh my God, I can't believe it, because you don't want to face this negativity. In this moment, it could be either one of those two things. She could be closing her eyes to focus and try to figure out how she's going to tackle this uncomfortable question, or she could be blocking the eyes like this to signal that she doesn't want to deal with this. This is very well supported with this stop gesture that we see in her right hand. Now, palm orientation is not universal across cultures. In other words, different cultures use different palm orientations as they communicate. But the palm outwards like this with the fingers out is universal, and no matter where you're tuning in from, you will recognize this gesture as us trying to stop something, often combined with an oscillating gesture like this, but just the palm out is stop. Sometimes it even happens as a reflex. As we're startled, the hand comes out like this, or if we're trying to stop someone to get their attention. Now, we do need to consider Pam Bondi's baseline as well, which is really, really interesting. Baseline means the way we behave when we're not stressed within a specific conversation. That's very important. So during this hearing, when she's not stressed, how does she behave? So I watched this whole thing. And I watched her behaviors when she was answering questions that she's more comfortable with, coming from politicians that she's more comfortable with. And it's very much part of her baseline to talk with the fingers outwards like this, to the point where it actually really stands out to me. Because very often, most people, as they gesture, the fingers come in, the fingers come out like this. With her, she does a lot of this. The orientation changes, but the fingers stay pretty out like this. But we don't often see the stop gesture up here. We see her hands on her desk, we see her gesturing like this, we see some of this, fingers out, very common, but this, not so common. This is even further backed up by the fact that she does something called batoning. So we see the one finger come out like this as she briskly gestures like this, which she pretty much never does when she's relaxed or talking about a topic that she's comfortable with. This only happens when she's being very strict and putting down the law or confronting something head on. And this is backed up by research as well. Alan and Barbara Pease are two of the biggest researchers and authors on the subject of body language, and they did research on different hand positions when someone's speaking. And they found that this hand gesture like this with one finger outwards is the one that makes an audience feel the most disconnected and makes the speaker seem the most negative. And that makes sense, because if you think about historically what this resembles, it looks like a weapon, like a sword or a stick. And this is why we often see this when someone's angry or someone's disciplining, and it creates a big disconnect. But although all these gestures are important, what's really important here is the shift. So in the beginning, we're seeing these eye blocks, we're seeing this hesitation before she starts to answer, we're seeing this slower speech. But the moment she realizes how she's going to tackle this, she becomes a lot more feisty, her tone goes up, she starts speaking faster, and this is where we start seeing this batoning disciplinary gesture. There's also something verbally here that stands out, and it's the way that she's answering this question. There's a direct question being asked. Was Donald Trump at events where there were some underage girls? And she immediately shuts down the question, calls it ridiculous, and then says that they're just trying to deflect from all the amazing things that Trump has done. And here's the thing, she's a lawyer. She understands relevance, and that answer is not relevant to the question that was asked. Look, if during a completely different event or press conference, she wants to talk about all the good that she believes this administration is doing, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with listing those things. But here, in this hearing, that's not what she's there for. She's there to answer the questions that they have, and right now, they're talking about this. So by her saying they're just trying to deflect away from all the good things that he's done, they're not here to talk about the good things. They're here to get to the bottom of the Epstein files. And again, as a lawyer, she knows exactly what she's doing, and it's ironic that she's saying that they're the ones deflecting when this entire response is a deflection. Speaking of deflecting, let's dial it back to the first question about former Prince Andrew, which the congressman sets up in a very interesting way. So he shows two very compromising photos involving an underage girl. and her face has been censored. And he asks Pam Bondi, the reason this is censored, the reason we can't see her, is because by law, you have censored pictures of victims to protect them. Is that correct? And Pam Bondi says yes, which really sets up a very interesting situation that we're going to see later on how that develops. And so the congressman asks, then why haven't you prosecuted former Prince Andrew? And that's a good question, because based on what she just said, they censored the face of the young woman in this picture because in this picture, she's a victim. And therefore, he's potentially committing a crime in this picture. That's what victim means. So instead of answering the question as to why they haven't gone after him, she does something else that she's going to do constantly throughout this hearing. And she says, I don't remember you asking Merrick Garland that question. And Merrick Garland was Joe Biden's Attorney General during Joe Biden's presidency. And she often says, well, why didn't you ask him that? And in so doing, I get that it's a deflection. I get that it gets her off this topic, but it also kind of highlights the fact that these questions are worth asking. It's kind of a double-edged sword, because if she thought it was a stupid question, she would go, that's a stupid question. Or she would just answer it, because what does it matter? But by turning it around and saying, well, you should have asked the guy before me, she's kind of admitting that this is an important question, even if she's refusing to answer it. But the congressman here does something quite clever, which a lot of the other ones didn't do because they let this distraction kind of derail the conversation. He says, I agree with you. Merrick Garland did mess this up, as did the one before him and the one before him. This has been messed up for decades, but you're in a position now where you can actually make a difference. So this kind of counters her saying, well, why didn't you ask the guy before me? He's going, no, we should have asked all of them, but now you're here, so we're asking you. And it's interesting because it seemed like she was going to answer, but he took his time back to move on to the next topic. And I would have really liked to see what she was going to say there, because by countering that, he actually put her in a position where now she has to answer, what's going on? Why aren't you going after these people? All right, now we're going to move on and look at the rest of this question, which got really heated, other key moments, and behaviors that led me to a conclusion that I think is worth your consideration. But before we do me a huge favor, hit that subscribe button, turn those notifications on, and take a quick second to like this video, because it really does help with the success of the channel.
Time belongs to the gentleman from California.
Okay. I'm going to put up another document from a witness who called the FBI's National Threat Operations Center, because I believe you just lied under oath. There is ample evidence in the Epstein file.
Don't you ever accuse me of a crime.
I believe you just lied under oath, and this is on videotape. You said there's no evidence of a crime. I'm showing you, here is a witness statement who called into the FBI's Threat Operations Center. He drove Donald Trump around in a limo. He overheard what Donald Trump said to Jeffrey on his cell phone. He was so angry, he was gonna stop a limo and hurt Donald Trump. And he met a girl who said she was raped by Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein. She later had her head blown off, and officers at the scene said that could not have been suicide. No one at the Department of Justice interviewed this witness. You need to interview this witness immediately. And as we say here today, there are over 1,000 sex trafficking victims, and you have not held a single man accountable. Shame on you. If you had any decency, you would resign right after this hearing concludes.
The gentleman has expired.
May I respond?
Yeah, I don't know how you respond. No one can.
I did not ask a question, Ms.
He doesn't
You're
want to
allowed
talk
to.
about
I did
the
not ask a
horrific
question.
crime in California. He does not want to talk about
I did not ask a
crime
question.
in his state.
She can't just
Madam
ad-lib
Attorney
stuff. I did not ask a question.
Committee will be in order. The gentleman has yielded back his time. I think our next witness will be more than happy to let the Attorney General
Madam
respond.
Attorney General, would you like to?
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized for 5 minutes.
You have a few minutes to respond.
Thank you, Congressman. This is what Congressman Liu didn't want to talk about. He didn't want to talk about all the crime that is happening in his state. California refuses to honor detainees because of its dangerous sanctuary city policies.
All right, so this one's not so much about body language as much as it's about the psychology of conversation and interrogation, which we're going to talk a lot about during this video. And there's quite a few things happening here, but before we look at them, I want to talk about something globally that's happening with this whole Epstein files thing. It's become this politically loaded witch hunt, where one side says, look at all these names from your side, and the other side goes, yeah, well, look at all these names from your side. And I think that that entire conversation shifts the focus from what's important. And what's important is to look at these files thoroughly, conduct solid investigations to figure out which of these testimonies are credible and who should be prosecuted for these crimes. There are millions of files and a lot of names in them, but these aren't all criminal files. Some of these are emails, invites to fundraisers, parties, big events. I mean, this guy had a very wide reach. So it's important to, instead of just trying to one-up the other side, like my guy comes up less than your guy, to just go, no, none of that matters. Let's figure out why these people were involved. Is it criminal? And let's prosecute the ones that were criminal. And this witness statement that's brought up in this question is a really good example of that. Now, obviously, he's trying to put her in a corner because she said that there's no evidence that Donald Trump has committed any crimes. And he brings this up and goes, well, there's something here that really, really strongly indicates that. And she gets all riled up because he's suggesting or saying that he believes she lied under oath. But what he says next is really important because he says that somebody needs to interview this witness. And that is 100% objectively correct. It's very difficult to believe that the DOJ did a thorough investigation when for a very long time they were stating that, there's no proof that anybody besides Epstein was involved in these crimes. Now we know that there were. And then there's things like this where they haven't interviewed these individuals. So it's a very hard position for her to defend that they've done a thorough job. Interview these people, get to the bottom of it. Now, where this takes a turn that's really not a great look for Pam Bondi is in her response. In fact, she insists on responding. So I'm sitting there going, yeah, tell us why no one's interviewed people like this. And instead, she talks about the crime rate in California, where Congressman Liu is from. And she goes on to say all these different numbers and listing, this is what he doesn't want to talk about. But what do you mean this isn't what he wants to talk about? Once again, that's not why we're here. If you want to interrogate him on the crime happening in California, then he will have to answer those questions in a very different setting. But you're not here to talk about that. You're here to talk about the things that Congress is asking you. So what does that have to do with he doesn't want to talk about the crime in California? No, he doesn't. He wants to talk about Epstein. That's why he's asking questions about Epstein. What's mind-blowing to me is that not only is she an attorney, but she has the most important attorney job, arguably, in the entirety of the United States of America. She understands the law. There are segments in this where she talks about her extensive history as a prosecutor. So she knows that if she's got someone on the stand and she's asking questions, they're supposed to answer those questions. They can't be like, well, you don't want to talk about what you had for breakfast this morning. It doesn't matter. He gets to ask questions. She has to answer those questions.
General Bondi, it's been reported that there were at one point 1,000 personnel assigned to the task of identifying and scrubbing Donald Trump's name from the Epstein files. Were those reports accurate?
I believe his name has appeared countless times in the documents
how
that
many
have
people were
been released.
assigned?
If I could finish, I'm going to read you the stats.
No, I just simply asked whether or not it was true that it was 1,000 folks who were assigned that task. Were those reports accurate?
There are more than 500 attorneys and reviewers. I cannot give you an exact number.
And I wanted to ask you about that also, because this is a different question that you're getting to now. There were 500 DOJ lawyers and others assigned the task of redacting the appropriate information, including identities of the Epstein victim survivors from the Epstein files prior to their release. 500, is that correct?
If I could have finished my answer, there were more than 500 attorneys and reviewers who assisted with the. They asked the question and they don't want an answer.
That answers my question, ma'am, and I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on. You are acutely aware of how important it is to protect the identity of victims of assault, correct?
I have addressed this multiple times. I think others were cutting me off when I was trying to.
Well, I just simply asked, are you aware of the fact that it's vitally important to protect the identity of assault victims as you prosecute the people they accuse of assaulting them. Isn't that correct?
Excuse me. As we have said multiple times,
Protection of the
protection
identity
of all victims
of the victims
are
is
protected.
so very
Who are
important.
protected under? Do you want me to answer or do you want to interrupt?
Well, because you're not answering the question. You do a Jekyll and Hyde kind of routine around here. We have the Epstein victim survivors here today. Representative Jayapal asked a simple question: if you would be so kind and honorable as to turn around and face them and apologize to them for outing them. I mean, how many lives have been derailed because your department was either sloppy and incompetent or willfully trying to intimidate and punish these ladies for coming forward?
The time of the
Which
gentleman,
was it?
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin for 5 minutes.
All right, so the conversation with this congressman was actually quite a bit longer than this, and throughout the entire thing, it almost seemed like with every single question, she was trying to use the most amount of words possible to questions that could have been answered by yes or no. There's even a point where he asks her about her history as an attorney and saying, is it true that you have this kind of experience, where he was just looking for a yes, and she goes into these massive resume statements where she again takes this long to answer something that he just wanted a quick answer to move on with the conversation.
General Bondi, would you agree that your 8 years of service as the state of Florida's Attorney General, the third largest state in the nation, served as an excellent preparation for your current role as Attorney General for the United States of America?
Not only that, I was a career prosecutor for 18 years.
And for
18 years.
And for 18
prior
years,
to being
for 18 years,
he asked a
you
question and doesn't want an
prosecuted-
answer. This is theatrics.
Well, no, for 18 years, you
on.
prosecuted serious felony cases, including drug cases, correct?
Oh, I prosecuted homicides. I prosecuted capital cases. I prosecuted domestic violence cases. I prosecuted multiple cases, and that's why I feel for all of these victims. And did you ask Merrick Garland this when you were sitting before him, sir?
And it seems like she's purposely stretching it out, which really is confirmed by the fact that at the end, after he talks about how, you know, these survivors are behind you and we've asked you if you could just stand up and address them, her answer to that is, you're out of time. It's almost like she's waiting, dragging out the answers with her eyes on the amount of time that he has left, and at the end, she's literally going, you're out of time, I don't have to talk to you anymore. Now again, baseline is important, and this is a huge contrast between the way she was answering questions that had nothing to do with Epstein and that were coming from congressmen that, let's say, she gets along with more, like this example.
Biden-Harris DOJ raided President Trump's home.
They did.
Did the Biden-Harris DOJ allow Jack Smith to spy on over a dozen Republican members of Congress?
Absolutely.
Did the Biden-Harris DOJ seize the phone of a sitting Republican congressman?
Yes.
Did the Biden-Harris DOJ and Jack Smith pay at least $20,000 to confidential human sources to provide information on President Trump?
At least.
However, even with these long drawn-out answers, there's some very interesting behaviors going on. Like right in the beginning, the congressman asks a question that in psychology we call a double bind. And I don't know if he's doing this consciously or subconsciously, but this is any situation where a question is asked, and regardless of how the person answers it, the questioner still gets what they want. So in this case, he is saying, is it true that there were 1,000 employees at the DOJ who were tasked with scrubbing Donald Trump's name from these files? Now this sets up a really interesting situation, because if she says yes to that, then it looks like they took a lot of measures to remove his name. On the other hand, to counter that, she can answer what she answered, which is to say, well, no, not really, because his name is in there countless times. Those are her words. And what's really interesting about that is I don't think that in the moment she realizes what she just said, because she's really excited and giddy about correcting the congressman and saying, no, you're wrong, that's not true, we didn't do that. And we see this in her body language, because as she's saying that his name appears countless times, there's this bit of a giggle, which you could interpret as a nervous chuckle, chuckle, but it almost seems like a slight mocking chuckle. And we even see what we call a gravity-defying moment. There's this little upwards pop, which is something that we often do when we're excited about something, literally subconsciously jumping for joy. I think she's so excited at the thought of correcting him and saying, no, you're wrong, that didn't happen, ha, got you, that she doesn't realize that she's literally confirming that his name does come up in the files countless times, which directly contradicts things that the head of the FBI, Kash Patel, has said. Another thing that she's doing, which we saw previously, is that she's trying to get ahead of the question. He didn't ask, does his name appear? Does it not appear? Were they good at their jobs? Did they effectively scrub his name? That's not what he's saying. He's saying, were there in fact 1,000 employees who were tasked with doing that? She knows where this is going and she's trying to get ahead of him. If we skip towards the end, he asks her, you know the importance of protecting the identities of victims or survivors, don't you? Isn't that correct? And she responds, I've addressed this many times before, and the others were cutting off while I tried to answer that, which is a non-answer statement. She's not answering the question. She's referencing other times she addressed this, and is much longer than a yes or a no. I mean, it's a yes or no question. This is her, again, taking what could be a very simple answer and dragging it out. And the reason she's doing this is because in saying yes, that's very important, it would kind of put her in a corner, because we're going to see in a moment there's this list that was released that was a colossal mess up. So she's in a very hard spot where by saying, yes, it's important to protect them, the congressmen and women could go, well, you didn't. And we have a very good example of that. And if she says, no, it's not important to protect them, she looks like the worst human being on the planet.
I just think we start out by making sure those redactions are unredacted, those Epstein files, to make sure that the public, according to the law, following the law, that those names in those files are made public. We have to make sure we tell those predators there is no place for them to hide, and if they commit the crime, they're gonna fry for it. It starts with showing us the names of the perpetrators in the Epstein files.
May I respond to that?
Sure.
Okay. So if any man's name was redacted that should not have been, we will, of course, unredact it. If a victim's name was unredacted, please bring it to us and we will redact it. We were given 30 days to review and redact and unredact millions of pages of documents. Our
Madam,
error rate is very low,
the
but there are
victims are
always
right behind you. We've got to convince them
sides,
that we're doing a good job
doing everything we can to help
protecting
the
them.
victims. We will
Thank
do
you,
everything
Mr.
we can.
Chair, I'm out of time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Kiley, is recognized.
I actually think that this was one of the best responses with the most potential, but because everyone was there for this witch hunt and playing the blame game, they missed it. And they could have done a lot with this answer. In fact, it's like in an interrogation or interview room, it's like there's this big stone castle and we're just trying to find a way in, and this could have been a way in, because she said something here that up until this point she was very much avoiding saying. This could very well be due to the fact that the man speaking here was a little less confrontational, came in a little less hot, and you can even see in her response that she's a little bit more cooperative. But let's look at some of the behaviors. First of all, there's a couple of chuckles here when she's saying, that there were millions of documents to look at.
Was unredacted, review and redact and unredact.
And it's quite a little bit different from that little giggle that she had when she was talking about how Donald Trump's name comes up countless times in these files. First of all, we don't have that upwards kind of gesture like this. In fact, in this case, she's doing something we call turtling. And turtling is when we become smaller. Like a turtle retreating into its shell, when we become defensive or we feel like we're talking about something stressful, things come in close like this to protect the vital parts of the body. And you'll notice here, she's hunched, she's smaller, and her gestures are more downwards. And that chuckle is a lower, like nervous chuckle, as opposed to the other one that could have still been a bit of a nervous giggle. It's very hard to tell, but came off very different from this one.
I believe his name has appeared countless times in the document.
But one of the most important things that she said in this response, in fact, one of the most important things that she said in this entire hearing pertaining to the Epstein files, is when she said, Our rate of error was very low, but there will always be errors on both sides. In an interrogation or interview room, we are hoping for that moment, what we call a tiny, minuscule confession that we could take and kind of open that up and see where we can take it. So the right thing to do there, in a very non-confrontational way, as opposed to, aha, I knew it, you made mistakes. No, in a very calm way, you go, okay, would you mind sharing what you believe some of those errors were? Or what are some specific examples that come to mind when you say there are some things that should be released that haven't been, and some examples of things that should have been kept private that were released by mistake? Non-confrontationally, by the way, that's very important. I have a whole video on the channel where I talk about scientifically proven methods to have conversations to get people to open up more. And I'll leave a link in the description. This is for all types of conversations in day-to-day life. And there are ways you do this where it makes people want to have this conversation if you're not looking for that aha moment. And this would have been a great opportunity to go down that line of questioning. Before we move on to the next clip, which I think is one of the most important ones of the whole hearing, I want to mention something that I've said before on the channel, but I think is really important, especially for the viewers who are relatively new. I know that a lot of this specific analysis feels like I'm hating on Pam Bondi, but please keep in mind that none of this is coming from a place of bias or subjectivity. Yes, of course, in this case, I feel like the Epstein file has been mishandled, but this isn't me having a bias and looking for evidence that Pam Bondi is messing up. In the history of this channel, depending on the analysis, I've been accused of being a huge MAGA Trump supporter, and I've been accused of being a giant liberal Trump hater. That's because what I do, and it's a big part of my training, is to look at things completely objectively. So yes, one week it could look like I'm saying, there's nothing here, it's not a big deal, everything's fine. And the other week it looks like I'm really going after a person, but that's because it is a case by case. So in this case, yeah, this video is about the Epstein files, and overall I do believe that it was extremely mishandled. I believe that there was a lot of deception. I made several videos about that. It doesn't mean that I think Pam Bondi is the worst human being on the face of the planet and she's never done anything right. It simply means that I believe that in this case, there's a lot of deception and there are a lot of things that were mishandled, but it's not personal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Behind me, I have 3 documents from the DOJ production that are emblematic of the massive failure of the DOJ to comply with the Epstein Files Transparency Act. To my right is an email that was sent by the victim's lawyers to the DOJ. It was a list of names not to redact, a list of names not to release. What did the DOJ do with this email? They released this email in the document production. Literally the worst thing you could do to the survivors, you did. And they're getting phone calls. A lot of these people didn't want to be known. And we know you touched the document because you redacted one name and you redacted the lawyer's name, but you left the survivor's name there. The title of this one is Child Trafficking, Co-Conspirators, fully redacted. And by the way, I'm gonna unredact them here. Les Wexner is in this. Now your your deputy attorney general said, oh, well, he appears hundreds of times in the files, but he doesn't appear in this file until I forced you to release it, where he's listed as a co-conspirator, not to tax evasion, but to child trafficking. So I have several questions for you. Who's responsible? Are you able to track who in your organization made this massive failure and released the victims' names? Are you able to track who it was that obscured Les Wexner's name as a co-conspirator in an FBI document? Do you have that kind of accountability?
I believe Wexner's name was listed more than 4,000 times.
Yeah, I already told you that. This is where he's listed as a co-conspirator.
Can I finish my answer? Come on, let me finish my answer. We corrected that within 40 minutes. Wexner's name was added back.
Within 40 minutes of me catching you red-handed.
There was one redaction out
where
of
he's
over
listed as a co-conspirator.
And we invited you in. This guy has Trump derangement syndrome. He needs to get, you're a failed politician.
Gentlemen,
you need to
I
get
want you to watch the video.
Mr. Chairman, please restore his time and remind the witness of the rules here.
There is no credible information. None. If there were, I would bring the case yesterday that he trafficked to other individuals.
Is that your position as well?
My position is Any victim who comes forward, of course, we would love to hear from them. 1-800-CALL-FBI. Did you ask Merrick Garland that the last 4 years? Did you talk about Epstein?
I am reclaiming
at all
my
the
time.
last
I'm
4
glad you're
years?
asking about Merrick Garland.
You don't get to reclaim
because
time
this
when
is
you don't-
bigger
when
than
you can't-
Watergate.
when I don't answer a question the
this
way you
goes
want.
over 4 administrations.
This clip is huge. So the congressman here very clearly showed 2 massive mess ups. One is a list that was specifically, the intention of the list was to say, do not release these names. They do not consent. This is a lawyer sending this. And they included that list unredacted in the files. That's insane. And then he has another example of something that was redacted that very much should not have been. So he's making a very good point. And he's setting up a very good situation where he's presenting a problem. And in any conversation, in any walk of life, when you set up a problem, you have 2 paths that are present in front of you. One is conflict, one is collaboration. And it's often the tonality and the way the questions are asked from the person who brings the problem up that dictate whether we're going to go to conflict or collaboration. Now, the tone here, obviously, it's pretty much too late for that. It's become this massive conflict. Everyone, once again, is after this big witch hunt. But there's something interesting about the way he asked his question, or more specifically, the question he asked. Because he sets up this big problem. And there would be a way here to just relax everything, release that tension and say, you know, do you see how this was an issue? With all due respect, I know you guys had a lot of files to look at. It couldn't have been easy, but do you see how much of a colossal issue this was? What do you think should be done? What do you think we should do moving forward? Let's collaborate on this. Let's figure it out, because there are real people here that are suffering. Instead, he asks for accountability, which I understand. There should be accountability. But when you set this up and you say, do you know who's responsible for this? Are you going to take accountability? As opposed to, there was this big mess up. How can we fix this? How can we make this better? And again, I feel like if it was that approach, I'm not saying for sure, but maybe a little bit more progress would have taken place. And then the big moment where they play a clip from Kash Patel's hearing, that's the director of the FBI, where he said that there's no evidence, no credible evidence that Epstein trafficked to anyone besides himself. And then it cuts back to Pam Bondi being asked if she believes the same thing. And again, this is a double bind in a way, because by saying, yeah, I believe the same thing, there's no credible evidence, she looks extremely incompetent, because now that the files are released, there's quite a bit of evidence that there were other people involved in this. And if she says, no, I don't believe that, she's literally suggesting that under oath, the director of the FBI was deceptive. So it's a very, very difficult position, which is exactly why we get this complete non-answer statement. Whereas this is a yes or no question. Do you agree with what he said? We get what I believe is that any victim who wants to come forward would love to hear from them, which is a massive derailing of the question. But immediately after that, she goes right back to her, you didn't ask Merrick Garland these questions, which again is such a deflection, because whether they asked Merrick Garland or not doesn't reduce the importance of them asking these questions now. They're choosing to ask this, they're allowed to ask the questions you want, and she keeps going back to this. And even a little before that, she said, this guy has Trump derangement syndrome, which was a weird thing to say, because this was not one of the congressmen who was actively trying to go after Donald Trump. He was talking about the list that shouldn't have been released, and then he was talking about Les Wexner. So it was bizarre for her to throw that in, but I think she just has these canned sentences that she goes to just move away from the Epstein topic and say, you guys don't want to talk about the crime in your states. You guys are just trying to go after Donald Trump. You guys didn't ask these questions to Merrick Garland. So these are just these canned little places that she's going to try to turn the attention back on the people asking the questions, even if they don't really relate to the question that was asked. Body language-wise, there's a really interesting moment towards the end when she's saying that they would love to hear from any victim who wants to come forward, where twice, as she's saying that, she looks down like this. And one of them is that she's saying, of course, we would love to hear from them. And then she looks down again. Now, throughout this hearing, she's often looking down at the table, but in those moments, we see her clearly looking down at her notes. Here, she's looking a little bit further out from her notes, but there's a lot on that table and there is some papers there. So I don't know if there's something that she's looking down to. As a refresher, it's hard to tell. And keep in mind that behaviors are not absolute. Behavioral cues are behavioral clues. So we look at the whole package and try to put it together to see what they indicate. So is it possible that there's a note, something she's looking to? You know, she says a phone number, 1-800-CALL-FBI. Is that written down somewhere? It seems like the type of number that she would know off the top of her head, but I don't know. It's possible she's looking down, but if there isn't a note or something down there, it's also possible that this is a moment of shame where she can't confidently say this sentence because she knows, and I'm about to show you a moment where it's confirmed, that historically they have not made it easy for survivors to come forward and give their testimony. So it's possible that these looks down are her not really being able to present this confidently, but usually to make that determination, I would want to see a heck of a lot more. Some hesitation, some qualifiers, her words falling apart, kind of the confidence dropping a little bit more. That said, later in the hearing, there is a strong moment that directly contradicts what she's saying here, that they would love to hear from the survivors because this moment happens.
Now, would the survivors and victims who are here please stand up one more time? Just by show of hands, how many of you or your loved ones actually have met with the Department of Justice and provided testimony and evidence? None. And of those of you who have not met, which is everyone, how many of you have reached out either individually or through a lawyer or representative to offer to provide testimony and evidence? All of them. And of those of you, all of you, who have reached out, how many of you were denied or ignored by the Department of Justice? All of them. And despite the shameful and despicable efforts by Ms. Bondi and her department to intimidate you, how many of you are still willing to speak to the Department of Justice? All of them. Well, Ms. Bondi, it looks like you have some more witnesses
Gentleman's
to
time
talk
has expired.
to.
That's not ambiguous. That's not some of them saying one thing while others are disagreeing. That's all the survivors in the room saying that they tried to reach out, would be willing to talk to someone, but nobody has reached out to them to talk to them. And this is a big part of the reason that Pam Bondi has to evade a lot of these questions, has to dodge a lot of these questions, because some of these, let's call them shortcomings, to put it lightly, are very blatant and obvious. The fact that none of these victims were able to get through, the fact that there's an email, that the subject of this email is to say, do not release these names. They're not willing, and they release those names. That's a colossal mess up. So there are all these undeniable things that indicate that the ball was dropped again and again, not to mention how long it took, where they said, there's nothing to release, we don't have anything, and it turns out they have millions of things that they're releasing, and we're going, yeah, this is what we wanted, and there's still more that has not been released. So all these things together is not a great look for her, which is why we're getting all these deflections, all these non-answers, and all these blame shifting. And she keeps throughout the hearing, I'll leave the link in the description, go check it out. She keeps turning it around and saying what the person asking the question is doing wrong in their state and refuses to talk about the things that they're asking about. And all this is because if she is truthful, she would have to admit that they dropped the ball on a lot of fronts. Before we go, I want to submit something for your consideration that for me might explain a lot of the behaviors that we saw here. Because let's be honest, Pam Bondi is many things, but a giant idiot is not one of those things. And she knows what legal proceedings are, she knows what relevance is, she knows the answers that these lawmakers are looking for, and it's pretty much impossible to not notice to what extent she's derailing the conversation and stretching it out. So I've been thinking about how there's a narrative out there about Jeffrey Epstein, right? The mainstream media narrative is that he took his own life. However, there are a lot of individuals that are skeptical of that for good reason. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't subscribe to conspiracy theories usually, but I think that in this case, the skepticism or the questions about the circumstances of his demise are very reasonable. So even within that bracket, there are two different schools of thought. One is that he's still out there somewhere, and the other one is that he didn't take his own life, but somebody else did, or was assisted to some capacity. The beauty of my theory when it comes to Pam Bondi is that it doesn't matter which of those things is true. What matters is what they have in common, which is the fact that right now, Jeffrey Epstein is off the table. And there's a very good chance that the reason he's off the table is because of the information that he had, which is very compromising for some pretty powerful people. Unless we subscribe to the theory that he took his own life because he was going to spend the rest of his life in jail, which I think is unlikely because there wasn't even a sentence yet, there wasn't even a trial yet, and we're talking about a pretty arrogant guy with a lot of money who probably would have thought he has good chances of getting out of this somehow. If this was further down the line, like after a sentence, and he took his life, maybe, but this is a little premature for me to be extremely confident of that. So let's assume that his death is related to the information that he had. And so it's reasonable to assume that anybody looking for this information or anybody who has this information is also in danger, which is why the congressman that we just saw, Thomas Massie, on social media wrote a post saying that he eats nutritious food, his breaks are fine, that he's not suicidal, that there aren't big masses of water on his property, that he's a good swimmer, basically assuring the public that if he's found dead as a result of an accident or suicide, that's not what happened because these things are extremely unlikely. So anybody who has this information, anybody who knows the reality of what's going on here, probably has very compromising information on some very, very powerful people. And Pam Bondi knows what's going on here. Kash Patel knows what's going on here. So hypothetically, if they know everything that Jeffrey Epstein knew, who's to say that they're not going to end up exactly where Jeffrey Epstein ended up? So it's possible, not saying 100%, but it's possible that a lot of what we're seeing here, whether it's with her or with Kash Patel, is coming from a place of fear, of knowing that if they say too much or tip too much or kind of insinuate that they know a little too much, they'll end up where the last person who knew this information ended up. And that person is Jeffrey Epstein. It's a scary situation and could potentially explain why a very competent lawyer is completely derailing a line of questioning like this, spinning it around, not giving direct answers to anything, and is very stressed by this topic. And we're sitting here going, that stress is caused by deception, but what if it's caused by the fear of consequence? It's almost impossible to distinguish between those two things because the body language that we see when someone's being deceptive is due to a fear of consequence. So for your consideration, I submit that maybe the consequence here isn't being caught in a lie, but something a lot more threatening to her life. It's possible. But let me know in the comments what you think. Which of her answers were the biggest red flags for you? But most importantly, do you feel that what we're seeing here, this dodginess, is due to the fact that if she answers these questions, it makes it very obvious that they messed up this whole case? Or is it due to something deeper and scarier than that? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you on the next one.